I'm Keith Becker, property manager here in Sonoma County. One of my tenants passed away this week. It's not the first time. I've been doing this for nearly 25 years, and in that time, nearly 25 tenants have passed away. And each and every time it's a tragedy. And each and every time it's sorrow and loss. As a property manager, however, you find yourself in a situation where even in the midst of this sorrow and sadness, and sometimes just terrible circumstances, because not everybody dies peacefully. But even in the midst of this, as a property manager, you have to be thinking about the future. Because as a property manager, the liability that you have, there's a lot of facets to it, and it can play out in unexpected ways. You've got this situation, the passing today. Let's talk about it. You've got today, you talk about the future, you talk about the past. I'd like to talk about the future, and talking about the future, why it is so critical that you plan and you act properly, even in the midst of such a situation. Let's imagine my tenant. My tenant is Uncle Fred to 18 different nephews and nieces. And Uncle Fred was a bit of a nerd, and he had a world-class comic collection. And suppose that he had a copy of Action Comics #1, the most expensive comic in the world. And it was promised to one of those 18 nieces. And somehow it's gotten lost in the midst of Uncle Fred's passing. And what on earth happened with the property in the immediate aftermath of his demise? It's a real thing. This is a real thing. As a property manager, as a landlord, as a housing provider, you have a responsibility to maintain the integrity, the safety, the security of your tenant's belongings until you can ensure that you've passed it on to the proper individual. And the fact is, if you do this wrong, you will not know until far in the future when somebody comes back and says, you goofed up. So, there's that issue in terms of how do you handle this. There's something that you might very well find yourself having to do in the middle of a demise. Somebody passes away, you're notified of it, and you might have to do something just really counterintuitive, and it sounds absolutely terrible. It sounds like it is indeed one of the worst things that I've found myself having to do in all of my career. But before I tell you what that is, I'm going to tell you how to avoid it. Especially when you have a single tenant. You have one tenant residing in a property all on their lonesome. What would happen? How would you proceed if that individual were to pass away? Do you know who their relatives are? Who do you call? What do you do? Well, years ago, we actually added onto our applications, we put on here emergency contact. And many applications say emergency contact, but we added one more line item there, and it says next of kin / emergency contact. That's very important. And you may not know how important it is until you actually need it. Next of kin is a legal term. Next of kin is a granting of authority for somebody else to be able to take responsibility, take action on your tenant's behalf. And the reason we put this on the application is because we tried to put it into our rental contracts, and we tried to put in a clause in our rental contracts where our tenants would sign in saying, in the event of something happening to me, I authorize this individual, whomever they're supposed to fill in, to take care of my affairs. The fact is that at the time you've got an applicant signing a rental contract, they're not thinking of anything terrible happening, and many of them were unwilling to fill out that component. And it's difficult to force them to do so. This trumps it, however. Why is this so important? Your responsibility as a housing provider, upon notification that your tenant has passed away, you are responsible for securing the property. What that means is that you're notified that the tenant has passed away. You have to rekey the property. You have to take all of the locks, switch them out for something that no one else has access to. And you and only you have access until you are notified who has the authority to handle the affairs of your demised tenant. The coroner's office has the authority to tell you who that person is. Or another party can show you that they've got a will or a power of attorney or something else that will allow them to conclusively state, I am authorized. But until you get that, theoretically, you are responsible for securing the property. This is why, and this is where it is so very terrible. You have family members who are distraught, who are in anguish, who are highly stressed out, and you're telling them that you, as the landlord, are preventing them from getting to their loved ones' personal belongings. And they will think you are an asshole. This is your job. Because if you don't do it right, you are going to find yourself at risk, at liability. Because the fact is, you don't know what the tenant's belongings are in there. You don't know what sort of valuables are there, and you do not want to get into the argument of what belongings have been absconded by some nephew who didn't have the right to take those items. So realize that unless you can, up front, make sure you know who your party is, you're going to lock the property down, and you're going to have to lock the property down. The blessing in this instance with my tenant who passed away is that they had filled this out, and they did fill out the next of kin. And I communicated with the next of kin, and we clarified everything as we needed to, and I provided him keys, and he's taking care of his dad's stuff. And I know that I've done this properly. There are many easy, simple things about being a housing provider, about being a landlord. But there are some that will happen very rarely, and when they do, they can very well trip you up if you do not know what you're doing. If there's anything we can do to help, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'm Keith Becker.